Within the Bible, there are three different types of poems that we see show up. One of the types of poems are going to be what we call orientation poems. Orientation poems are things are going as they should be going. So the people of God are following in God's ways and things are going good for them. But there's also what we could say disorientation poems. This is when things are not going as they should be going. And it could be in one of two ways. One way it could be is that the people of God are following God's ways and yet bad things are happening as they do. Or it could just be that the people of God are not following at all in God's ways. And then there's a third type of poem that we see in the Bible, and that is going to be reorientation poems. This is when God realigns his people to see him either freshly, to maybe rediscover an attribute of God, to see him maybe for the first time in a new light. If we had to sum up the book of Lamentations, as this is a collection of poems, which one would we choose? It would certainly have to be disorientation poems. And of all the chapters in Lamentations that really sum up this category, it's going to be chapters 2 and chapters 4. Within these chapters, we see the during and the after of the siege of Jerusalem. If you recall, in Lamentations chapter 1, we kind of see a bird's eye view of the city. The city is going to be personified as a widow who has lost her children, and she is just laid there desolate, asking for people to look at her. But in chapters 2 and 4, we kind of zoom in and we see the people who are hurt by the siege. We see princes and priests. We see young women and we see old men. We see mothers and we see children. And what Lamentations says over and over again, repeatedly, it never denies that this destruction, Lamentations says, was brought on by God's wrath. The wrath of God can be something that is difficult for us to really grapple with. We would much rather talk about the love of God, the peace of God, but the Bible does not shy away by also talking about the anger of God. And what the anger of God does in Lamentations is it creates this reversal in the city of Jerusalem. I want to summarize God's wrath in this definition. It is God's hatred for injustice. And so as God sees injustice running rampant in the city of Jerusalem, he finally decides to show up and say enough is enough. And as he does this, he creates 3 reversals take place in Jerusalem. I want us to name these reversals, see how they show up in chapters 2 and 4, but we're going to have to land by asking the question of, what is the purpose of God's wrath? What is it for? Is it simply just to show destruction? Is it simply just to be a punishment? Or is there anything else to it? There are going to be 3 reversals that we see in chapters 2 and 4. The first reversal is going to be a reversal of the city itself. The second reversal is going to be of the worship of God. And the third reversal, which is a little bit different than the previous 2, is going to be the reversal of the motherly role. I want to look at these, see them in the text, and we're going to ultimately see how God's wrath seems to turn the world upside down. So let's go ahead and look at this first reversal. The first reversal that we see is that the city is turned on its head. God's wrath comes into the city of Jerusalem, and it impacts the city itself and the people within the city. We see instead of the city being described as being built up, it is described as being torn down. Look at chapter 2, verse 6. The text says this: "He has broken down his booth like a garden. He has destroyed his tabernacle being the temple of God." In verse 9 of the same chapter, he says, "Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. So instead of the gates rising up for defense, they're sinking into the ground like in mud or in sand. But it's not just the city that is being reversed, it's the people within the city. Instead of the people being treated like they are precious, they are treated like they are just mere things. Look at chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. The text says this: "How the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The sacred stones lie scattered at the head of every street." We should stop and wonder, what are these sacred stones? Well, the text gives us the answer. The precious children of Zion, worth their weight in fine gold. How they are reckoned as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. What this text is saying is, at the corner of every street, there's a child laying there. I live in the city of Joplin, Missouri, and there are three things that can be for certain at the head of every street, or at least one of these. There's either going to be a Dollar General, a Casey's, or a church. No matter what street you go into, most likely you are going to see one of those three things. And what this text is saying is, at every street, you see a child either lifeless or their life is draining from their bodies. Verses 4 and 5 of chapter 4 continued this. "The tongue of the infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives them anything. Those who feasted on delicacies perish on the streets. Those who were brought up in pure purple cling to ash heaps." Children are unable to speak, is what this text is talking about. They desire food, they need water, and yet their mouths are so dry that they cannot even speak. And the idea is even if they could, no one has any food to give to them. Verse 7 through 8 continues, "Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral, their hair like sapphire. Now their visage is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as wood." What this is describing is as people, as they were grown up in shelter and being able to have products to keep their skin nice and healthy, now they are exposed to the sun all day long and their bodies are wearing thin and are becoming drier by the hour. The world is truly upside down because of God's wrath coming through. But it's not just a reversal of the city. It's a reversal of the worship. And this is kind of ironic because Jerusalem is supposed to be the city that worships Yahweh. And yet God says, "Cease to the worship. I no longer want to hear you." Chapter 2, verse 1 says, "How the Lord in his anger has humiliated daughter Zion. He has thrown down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger." Verse 7, "The Lord has scorned his altar. He has disowned his own sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. A clamor was raised in the house of the Lord as on a day of a festival." This is talking about how you can hear a ruckus going on in the temple, and it sounds like maybe worship is taking place, but as you come closer to hear it, you find out that it's noise of violence. That it's not noise of praise, but noise of hurting people and of mourning. Chapter 2, verse 9 epitomizes this, and it says, "The leaders' guidance is no more, and her prophets obtain no vision from the Lord." Truly, the world is upside down as God's wrath comes through. But the reversal doesn't end with the worship. We also see a reversal of the motherly role when it comes to the mom's relationship with the infant. We see this alluded to throughout the book of Lamentations, that because of the famine that takes place in the city due to the siege, a lack of food, a lack of water, that the people had to resort to cannibalism, eating their own people. The text alludes to this. It even says it earlier in the book, but it's in chapter 4, verse 10, that we see this described in the most gruesome way. The text says, "The compassionate women have boiled their own children. The infants became the food in the destruction of my people. where moms are the ones that are supposed to be nurturing the infant. Now in this moment, during the siege, the infant is nurturing the mother through their own lifeless body. The world is truly upside down. And Lamentations does not shy away from saying that this seems to be all because of the wrath of God. But what we discover is that they don't seem to be blaming God as if God is in the wrong for doing this. The poet seems to recognize that this all started because of the humans making the world upside down. If you remember from session 1, we talked about how it was the sins of Jerusalem that led to God allowing for Babylon to come to Jerusalem, besieging it, and ultimately destroying it. What God's wrath seems to do is demonstrate to the world that humans have already made the world upside down. We just choose to ignore it. And God's wrath just is his instrument of saying God will not ignore injustice. As a matter of fact, he will shove it into our faces. As we look at the sins of Jerusalem, we actually see that it seems to be injustices related to the city, to worship, and to those who are on the margins. We see that they commit injustices to the people. The leaders of Jerusalem hurt the people, the prophet Jeremiah says, by killing innocent people. They not only killed people, but they led them astray through witchcraft and evil sorcery. An abandonment of life, not caring for the precious life of others. The world was already upside down. The wrath of God was just making this known and saying enough is enough. We see an injustice towards God as the kings and the false prophets of Jerusalem end up worshiping other gods. They lead their people astray. They fashion idols into the temple and they worship gods like Baal and Asherah. They put up altars on the high places and they say it's okay to worship these gods instead of worshiping the Lord. In the city of Jerusalem where they're supposed to worship Yahweh, they make a mockery of his name, not caring about true worship. The world was already upside down. The wrath of God just demonstrated this. And then there was an injustice to those on the margins. We see the prophets say this over and over again. Israelites committed heinous acts like child sacrifice. They freed slaves and then took those people back into captivity. The elders and the princes of the people stole from the poor. They abused the poor and the widows, not taking care of the least of these. You see, the world was already upside down. The wrath of God just said enough is enough and puts a stop to it. 9 times throughout the book of Lamentations, the anger or the wrath of God is mentioned explicitly. And although it might make us feel uncomfortable, there seems to be a purpose to God's wrath. There is definitely punishment. But I think what God is ultimately doing with Jerusalem is that he is throwing them into a disoriented experience so that he can realign them with his ways. They had gone astray and they started saying what was good was evil. They didn't even know that they were disoriented. And so God's wrath disoriented the things around them in order to realign them with God's ways. Here's the dominant idea when it comes to Lamentations chapter 2 and chapter 4 pertaining to God's wrath. See, sorrow is going to be served out in these chapters. It is that God's judgment dishes out just desserts for the purpose of realigning his people with his ways. God's justice dishes out just desserts for the purpose of realigning God's people with his ways. There are times where we wonder where God's justice never let up, where God's wrath just continue over and over again. In chapter 2, it seems to be the case that it's going to happen, that it's never going to end. But matter of fact, though, when you get to the end of chapter 4, you see the poet recognizes that there is an end to the wrath of God. Chapter 4, verse 22, it says, "The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer." For those who look out into the world and see injustice, for those who look at their own lives and they feel abused or misused, they feel that the world is upside down, allow the book of Lamentations to point you to a God who is not satisfied with a world being as it is, hurt, abused, and oppressed, but instead desires to make all things right. Where God is at, yes, there is judgment, but where there is judgment, there is also realignment.